let's fight as we add some new enemies to our game. Let's see how to do that. And we find ourselves back in Unity once more in this tutorial to add enemies to the game. We're going to add two types of sort of swarmer enemies to the game that are going to try to follow the player. And once they hit the player takes damage and the enemy basically just dies. Now there's a few steps that we will go through. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a new sprite, and that is going to be the Goblin right here. So we're just going to drag this over to the sprites. And we know that the sprites are 16 big. We'll make this point, and once again, no compression. Let's hit apply. Right, so let's duplicate our scene here and make this 9 enemy. And let's also open it up. And then we can change our knight dummy here to become our goblin. So let's open the sprite renderer component and drag our goblin into the sprite here. This goblin is once again, of course, from Lobster. Link is in the description below. And then we will rename this game object to Goblin Enemy. Now we're actually going to need a few things, 2 scripts. One of them is going to be the EnemyData Script, and the other one is going to be the Enemy Script. So let's open up both of those. And first of all, let's go to the EnemyData Script. The EnemyData Script is actually not going to be that complicated. However, we are going to use something else, and that is going to be a scriptable object. As a very brief overview, a scriptable object basically holds some data for us that we can change. And you will see this in action shortly, but this is going to be really nice and really interesting for us to use to have different types of enemies. So we're going to have a public int HP, a public int damage, and a public float speed. So those are, let's say, the 3 enemy data points that we want for each enemy to be different. And then above this class, we're going to have these brackets, and then we're going to call create asset menu with file name equals data, comma, menu name equals scriptable objects / enemy, and then order is going to be equal to 1. And that's all that we need to do in the enemy data, and we can actually close this now. However, what we can do, and this is something really cool, if we now go back to Unity and let's, for example, make a new folder in our assets folder called enemies. The observant among you might have already seen it. If I right click again and then go to create, you will see that I all of a sudden have this scriptable objects here, and then I have this enemy here. I can create a new enemy data type. So for example, I can say swarmer here, for example, and then I can also duplicate this, Control D, and I'll also make a big swarmer just so that we have that already. So now I have 2 different enemy data types, and I can specify HP, damage, and speed in here. So for example, the normal swarmer might have 25 HP, it will make 5 damage, and it has a speed of 1.5. While the big swarmer has a lot more HP and does a lot more damage, but is very much a little bit slower. So only 0.75 speed. We'll see how to use those scriptable objects in just a moment. Let's open the enemy script and modify a few things in there. So an enemy has a few things. So like we've seen, we need a private integer damage. Let's call this 5 damage for the sake of argument. And we'll also have a private float speed. Put this to a 1.5, so those are the default values. If for whatever reason, for example, the data is not set, then we could use this. Then we want a serialized field private enemy data, and then the last thing we want is a private game object player. And the reason we wanted the player here is because we want to make sort of a swarmer enemy that basically follows the player until it hits the collider of the player, and then, well, basically the enemy dies. So there's a few things that we need to set up. One of them is the player. We're going to say GameObject.find GameObject with tag, and then we're going to say player. So we still need to add this tag, but we're going to do this after we are done with the enemy script here. Then we want is a private void called swarm. So this is the swarm method that basically will simply go towards the player. We're going to set this position equal to a vector2.move towards transform.position, player.transform.position, and then speed times time.delta time. Now this should seem vaguely familiar to you. This is the same code that we have used in the following the mouse, rather the following of the mouse delay. If you want to catch up, you can of course click the card at the top right corner now. It was a very interesting video as well. And then we will call the swarm method in the update method. So every frame, basically, we're trying to move towards the player. Then we, of course, also somehow need to get the player to take damage. And we're going to do this with the private void on trigger enter 2D. I'm going to rename this collider again. And then we will check if the collider has a tag called player. So we're going to call the compare tag method and then pass in player. Then we will check just in case that the collider actually has a get component health, so that a health script is actually attached to the player. So if this is unequal to null, then what we can do is we can take this and we can call damage the damage, and then we will say this.get component health is going to also take damage, and we're just going to do like 10,000. So then we know that this enemy will definitely die. I would rather call the damage method in here, because maybe in future we want to have a callback in this method, so it's better to damage it and then die instead of just destroying it outright, because this already handles the destroying for us. Well, now the big question comes in, well, where do we get our data from? Well, the data will be set via the inspector, but also the data had an HP value, so we could set health, and that is exactly correct. So we actually need to modify our health script just the tiniest bit, and we will simply add a public void set health method in here with an integer max health and an integer health. Max health is equal to max health. This.health is equal to health. And this can now be used to set the health of the enemy. So we'll make a new private void set enemy values, and we're going to say get component health, set health, and we're going to set this to data HP. So the max HP is the same as the HP. We could, of course, also extend the enemy data with a max HP. At the moment, this isn't really necessary. Then we can say damage is equal to data.damage, and then we can also say speed is equal to data.speed. If we now call this set enemy values method here in the start method, then what will happen is at the beginning of the enemy, it will look for a data object here and then set the values to whatever the data object is. So let's go in here and first of all add a tag to the knight. So these are some of the things that we have to do. So we will add the player tag here to the knight. What we'll also do is make this Goblin box collider a trigger. So this is now a trigger instead of a normal box collider. This should not interfere with any of the attacking logic. It will simply make it so that enemies don't collide with each other, and the Goblin will also damage the player once it hits. Now the player for that also is going to need a new collider. So we'll simply add a box collider 2D as well. Make it a little bit smaller so that it fits. So let's make the X value a little bit slimmer. There you go. This is a good approximation, I would say. We'll save this. So let's call this 0.6. Sure. And then the player is modified completely. The enemy, however, still needs the enemy script. So let's move the enemy script over. And as you can see now, there is a data field here. We can now take this swarmer enemy scriptable object and drag it in here, and it will then take the values from this swarmer that we have specified, so 25, 5 damage, and 1.5 speed, and apply them to this goblin enemy. So in theory, this should all work, so let's see if it works. As you can see, the enemy is now slowly following me, and the health has been set to 25, the damage to 5, and the speed to 1.5. If I hit it with my sword, then you can see that the health actually decreases by 3 each time I press the spacebar. I have to keep moving, and now if I, for example, stay still, then the enemy is going to hit me, and then as you can see, I have taken 5 damage, and I am dead was called from the enemy, and it has destroyed itself because it took 10,000 damage, as we have specified when it hits the player. Right, but I also have this big swarmer here. What are we going to do with this? Well, we're just going to duplicate this goblin enemy and call him, for example, big goblin enemy. Just for the sake of argument, we're going to make it a little bit bigger. So let's, for example, say 2 and 2. I think that that's fine. And then instead of the swarmer, we'll make the big swarmer in here. And what we'll also do is we'll create a new folder called PreFabs. We'll take the big goblin in here and put it into the PreFabs folder and the goblin enemy as well. And then we have those available if we ever need them again. For example, maybe we want to spawn multiple enemies, then those prefabs are going to come in very handy. But for the time being, let's just copy those. So let's just Control D, the big one. Let's move them around a little bit, give our player a little bit of a challenge. Copy this one and copy it one more time, something like that. And now if I start the game, every one of them is going to move. And as you can see, the big ones are going to move very much slower than the small ones. And I have to keep going in. Sometimes they're hitting me, sometimes they're not hitting me, and I can keep pressing the spacebar. I actually got hit there. What a shame. But the only thing that is really missing is some visual indication. But right now, the enemies of themselves, they actually work really well. Of course, the numbers might be changed a little bit, but that's the great thing. If I'm like, you know what, the big swarmer, I'm actually thinking he's a little bit too fast, right? I can put this to 0.65. And I can go to the swarmer and I say, you know, I actually think that this one's also too fast, so I can change it to 1.25. And I change it there once, I go in game, and then the values have been changed. So as you can see, now the enemy script has a speed of 1.25 and the big goblin enemy has a speed of 0.65. So let me just get everything in here, and I'm not even dead. I still have 30 health. That's pretty good. Overall, this is how easy it can be to add a simple enemy to the game. The only thing that's really missing is a sort of visual indicator, and this is exactly what we're gonna do next time. So this is already it for this tutorial right here. Once again, I hope you found this useful and you learned something new. I would of course appreciate a like if you did, and I will see you in the next tutorial. So yeah.